Why did the outlaws of Brazil's Badlands create punishments so disturbing that even seasoned soldiers refused to speak of them decades later? The deeper you look into the world of the Cangaço, the more you realize that brutality was never random. It was calculated, symbolic, and crafted to shape fear across an unforgiving land where reputation could decide life or death. In the vast Caatinga, a place where the law arrived late, if it arrived at all, the only real authority was the legend you managed to build around your own name. Every traveler who crossed those thorn-covered paths carried stories of men like Lampião and Maria, figures who blurred the line between hero and monster depending on who was telling the tale. But beneath all the myths, there was an invisible rule that held the entire system together. Punishment was not just a reaction. It was communication. A whispered warning, a theatrical display meant to fracture resistance long before a shot was fired. And this is where the darkest truths begin to surface, because the harshness of the land shaped the harshness of the men who ruled it. Fear in the sertão did not start with violence. It started with anticipation. Cangaceiros understood the power of letting dread grow before the first blow ever landed. Villagers described the same chilling pattern: the quiet before the raid, the coded messages scratched into a door, the eerie whistle echoing through the brush. These subtle signals reminded everyone that the outlaws were always watching, always judging. And once punishment arrived, it unfolded like a performance with rules only the bandits seemed to understand. The most disturbing part was that many punishments were built not to kill but to send a message. A rival who betrayed a pact could be marked rather than executed. His altered appearance announcing his crime to every settlement he dared enter. A suspected informant might be forced to walk back to his village carrying the exact symbol of the betrayal he was accused of. These acts left psychological scars deeper than physical ones, reinforcing a cycle in which fear itself became a weapon more powerful than any rifle. What makes these stories even more unsettling is how ritualistic some of them were. The sertão was a place of superstition, where saints and omens shaped decisions as much as bullets did. Cangaceiros often blended punishment with spiritual belief, creating moments that felt half justice and half curse. Witnesses described scenes where the environment, the silence, even the arrangement of the men formed part of the message, and you cannot help but wonder how many of these rituals were meant to terrify the victim, and how many were meant to terrify everyone else. This leaves us with a question that echoes across the dry winds of the Badlands. Were these punishments expressions of cruelty, or were they extensions of a survival code forged in isolation and conflict? The answer is more complex than it seems, and understanding it opens doors to parts of the Cangaço that history rarely dares to illuminate. You might even recognize patterns that still shape how power works in forgotten corners of the world. If any of this already resonates with you, or if you have seen how fear becomes a language of its own, share your thoughts in the comments, leave a like to support this investigation, and check if you are subscribed so you do not miss what comes next, because what you will uncover in the following chapter may surprise you as the story of these disturbing punishments continues to unfold. They say that once you understood fear as a form of communication, you were only a step away from understanding why cruelty appeared so methodical in the Cangaço. The outlaws knew that dominating a region required more than guns and surprise attacks. It required shaping the imagination of everyone who lived under the harsh sun of the Caatinga. A punishment delivered to one man could control the behavior of an entire village for months, sometimes years. That was the true power they cultivated, and it explains why their actions followed patterns that felt almost strategic rather than impulsive. People in the sertão learned quickly that violence had layers. A beating, for example, might seem like the simplest form of retribution, yet cangaceiros rarely used it in its basic form. They preferred to alter its meaning through context. Sometimes they made the offender walk miles back to his settlement, carrying a symbolic object tied to his crime, a burden meant to expose him to public humiliation. Other times the punishment happened in complete silence, with the bandits observing every reaction as if they were studying the psychology of the victim. Fear was not merely imposed, it was measured, but behind all this calculation existed something deeper, something fed by the outlaws' own constant paranoia. Every cangacero lived with the fear of betrayal, and this fear shaped the brutality they unleashed. They trusted almost no one. Villagers who offered food or shelter one night might report their location to the volantes the next. Even within the band, alliances shifted like desert winds. A careless word, a gesture misinterpreted, or a rumor whispered at the wrong moment could be enough to spark a punishment designed to serve as both warning and spectacle. That instability created an emotional tension inside the group that outsiders rarely understood. This mistrust extended to every corner of the sertão. The ground itself felt treacherous, covered with cacti sharp enough to tear through leather boots, as if nature mirrored the emotional landscape of the men who wandered through it. When a cangacero punished someone, he was not merely asserting dominance. He was reinforcing the fragile structure that held his world together. Without fear, without public examples, without the constant reinforcement of their authority, their power would dissolve in the dry heat and dust. And yet, despite all of this, there were moments when the brutality revealed patterns, not just of strategy, but of identity. Many cangaceros came from lives marked by poverty, hunger, abandonment, and personal traumas that hardened their instincts long before they ever picked up a rifle. For them, cruelty was less a choice and more a language learned from the environment. Every punishment they enacted carried echoes of their own suffering. Villagers recalled the unsettling way some bandits carried out these acts with a distant expression, as if reliving something rather than inventing it. These glimpses suggest that the violence of the Cangaço cannot be separated from the violence that shaped the men themselves. This leads to the unsettling realization that the punishments of the Cangaço were not just a tool for dominance, but also a reflection of internal chaos. Each act of cruelty served a dual purpose: to control the outside world and to silence the turmoil within. And as we move deeper into the stories of these outlaws, the line between calculated brutality and personal torment becomes even more difficult to draw, opening the door to darker truths that still wait beneath the dust of the Badlands. The deeper you follow this trail of violence, the clearer it becomes that suspicion was the true currency of the Cangaço. A whisper could be more dangerous than a bullet, because once someone was labeled a traitor, the punishment that followed went far beyond simple retribution. Informants, or even those merely suspected of passing information to the villain, face consequences crafted to erase identity and send a message far wider than any single act of execution. The outlaws believed betrayal was the one sin that threatened the entire structure of their existence, and their response had to be severe enough to keep the rest of the Villagers told stories of men dragged into the Caatinga at dusk, when the thorny brush swallowed light and sound. The bandits preferred this hour because darkness made the imagination work harder. People described hearing murmurs from the bushes, low voices debating guilt, retelling fragments of accusations, discussing whether mercy still had a place among them. Rarely did mercy win. What terrified witnesses most was not the violence itself, but the ritual that preceded it. The pauses, the slow silence, the eyes of the cangaceros fixed on the accused as if waiting for a confession that would never matter. That tension was part of the punishment. When the sentence finally arrived, it came with a logic shaped by the landscape. Some traitors were left alive, but altered, marked permanently so the world could read their crime before hearing it. A cut across the face, a missing ear, a brand pressed into the skin. These marks served as both warning and humiliation. A man could attempt to rebuild his life after such punishment, but the sertão was a place where stories traveled faster than people, and his mark ensured that the story arrived before he did. In the Cangaço worldview, a marked man became a walking testimony to the consequences of disloyalty. Others were not granted the chance to walk away. Some were tied to trees in remote patches of Caatinga, left under the scorching sun while vultures circled overhead. Not all died. Some returned half delirious, carrying tales that blended reality with hallucination. Their survival made them even more effective as instruments of fear. The bandits understood this psychology instinctively. A dead man could be forgotten. A survivor, especially one broken in both body and mind, kept the terror alive in every retelling. Inside the band, the threat of being mistaken for a traitor created an atmosphere of quiet paranoia. Cangaceiros slept lightly, rifles at arm's reach, never certain which alliances would hold. Stories speak of men who spent nights recounting their actions aloud, as if trying to prove their loyalty even in solitude. To outsiders, this sounded like madness, but to them, it was self-preservation. When betrayal was as deadly as a bullet, proving innocence became a lifelong state of vigilance. What makes these accounts even more haunting is how the boundary between justice and vengeance disappeared. Sometimes the accused was truly guilty. Sometimes he was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. And sometimes leaders used punishment to reinforce their dominance rather than to correct a betrayal. This ambiguity is what kept fear alive. No one ever knew the full rules, and uncertainty itself became a weapon sharper than any blade. As the legends of these punishments spread across the Badlands, they shaped the identity of the Cangaço as powerfully as their battles and raids. And from within this atmosphere of suspicion, another type of punishment emerged, one directed not at outsiders but at the very men sworn to uphold the brutal code that governed the outlaw world, revealing an even darker layer to the internal machinery of the country. The same tension that governed how traitors were punished also shaped the way cangaceiros disciplined their own. Inside the band, loyalty was everything, but loyalty was fragile. A careless action, a dispute over stolen goods, an insult whispered in the wrong moment, or even hesitation during a raid could trigger consequences that felt harsher than any punishment given to outsiders. What made these internal penalties especially terrifying was the intimacy behind them. These were not strangers judging a man. These were his companions, the people he marched beside under the scorching sun, the men who shared bullets, hunger, and blood with him. Many travelers who later encountered former cangaceiros described a common detail: the scars that did not match the stories of battle, thin slashes across the arms, circular burns along the ribs, crude stitching where flesh had clearly been opened deliberately rather than by accident. These marks hinted at the existence of a private justice system, a code that demanded fear and respect long before it demanded obedience. Leaders used these punishments to retain absolute control, and the men submitted because the alternative was expulsion. And in the Badlands, being expelled was often a death sentence. Cangaceiros lived by unwritten rules that outsiders never fully understood. You did not steal from a comrade. You did not question orders in moments of danger. You did not show weakness in front of villagers, and you never revealed internal discussions to anyone beyond the group. Breaking these rules meant facing punishments designed not just to correct behavior but to reinforce the hierarchy that held the band together. Sometimes the penalty was humiliation rather than injury. A man might be forced to walk behind the group for days, carrying equipment that was not his, a silent reminder that he had fallen out of favor. Yet there were moments when the punishments escalated into acts that revealed the darker psychology of life on the run. The endless tension, the constant threat of ambush, the isolation from the rest of the world created emotional fractures that leaders exploited. A man who hesitated during a firefight could be tied to a tree and forced to listen as the others reenacted the scene, analyzing his failure in cold detail. This was not only discipline, it was a way to make him relive the fear until the fear broke him into obedience. The sertão had no patience for fragile hearts. Women in the band often witnessed these internal punishments silently. Their presence added another layer of pressure, because humiliation carried additional weight when pride was part of survival. A man stripped of respect risked losing everything. Some leaders used this dynamic deliberately, punishing offenders in front of the entire group to ensure the memory stayed sharp. A single moment of disgrace could linger longer than any scar and become a warning whispered for years. What truly unsettles historians is how normalized these punishments became. The men accepted them not because they enjoyed suffering, but because they believed the structure kept them alive. The harshness was a shield against the chaos surrounding them. And yet, beneath this logic, something more vulnerable existed. Fear of weakness, fear of losing status, fear of becoming the next example. That fear shaped every interaction, tightening the bonds between them even as it created an atmosphere of constant threat. And from this internal world of discipline and fear, new layers of brutality emerged, turning punishment into a tool that reshaped identity itself, leaving marks that followed these men long after the raids and gunfire faded into legend. If any part of this harsh code raises questions in your mind or reminds you of how power can reshape human behavior, share your thoughts in the comments so we can explore these darker layers of the story together. Violence within the band shaped their identity, but the true horrors of the Cangaço often emerged when enemies fell into their hands. The punishments delivered to captured vigilantes rival outlaws, and authority figures spoke not only of revenge, but of a deeper need to reclaim dignity in a world where humiliation had marked many of these men long before they joined the Cangaço. Those who grew up watching their families displaced by Corone or witnessing soldiers abuse their communities carried wounds that did not fade. When one of these oppressors finally found himself at the mercy of the outlaws, the landscape of punishment changed completely. Captured enemies were often brought into the Caatinga, not to hide them but to isolate the moment, to mute the world so that the punishment unfolded with an intensity that only the desert silence could amplify. Witnesses described scenes where the cangaceiros formed a circle not out of ritual but out of a shared hunger for retribution. In these moments, the band acted less like a structured group and more like a collection of personal histories converging in a single act. Every man projected his own suffering onto the captive in the center, and the punishment became a release of everything they had endured. Some vigilantes were interrogated before receiving their fate. The questions were less about information and more about testing the enemy's resolve, unraveling the confidence of men who once believed themselves untouchable. When their fear cracked, it gave the outlaws a sense of power rarely felt in their daily struggle for survival. Many captives described the unsettling quiet of these moments, the way the cangaceiros observed them with cold curiosity, as if measuring how deeply their words and gestures revealed inner fractures. Punishments varied widely, shaped by the personality of the leader and the circumstances of capture. In some cases, the outlaws inflicted physical suffering meant to mirror what soldiers had done to villagers: beatings, binding limbs, and positions that caused excruciating tension, leaving the captive under the sun with no water or forcing him to face symbols of his authority stripped of power. Other times, the punishment was psychological. A man might be told he would be freed, only to realize too late that freedom meant being abandoned miles from any help, wounded, and carrying the shame of failure back to his unit. Not all captives survived, but the manner in which death arrived carried meaning. Some were killed quickly, as a message to the government. Others died slowly, not out of randomness, but because their punishment needed to resonate through the circle. When villagers discovered these bodies, they understood the intention immediately. The Cangaço was reminding everyone that power shifted depending on where you stood, and that even the strongest institutions could be humbled under the harsh sun of the battle. What made these punishments particularly disturbing was the way revenge intertwined with justice. To the cangaceiros, they were not simply eliminating an enemy. They were restoring balance in a world that had denied them fairness. Violence became a language through which they communicated the weight of their suffering. Every act reflected a mixture of rage, desperation, and a fractured sense of morality shaped by years of oppression. And as stories of these punishments spread, they changed how entire communities perceived the conflict, blurring the line between victim and aggressor. Yet even these brutal acts were only part of a larger ecosystem of control. Within the ranks, relationships shifted in response to these moments, revealing fractures and loyalties that would shape future decisions. And in the shadows of the camp, another complex dynamic unfolded, one involving the women whose presence added layers of tension, vulnerability, and authority to the outlaw world, influencing punishments in ways outsiders rarely understood. Life in the Cangaço was brutal for everyone, but no part of it exposed the contradictions of the outlaw world more sharply than the experiences of the women who lived alongside the men. These women carried rifles, marched through the Caatinga, endured the same hunger and thirst, and faced the same enemies. Yet at the same time, they were subjected to a separate set of rules, a mix of protection, possession, and punishment that revealed the unstable foundations of the cangaceiros moral code. Their presence shifted the emotional balance inside the band, often fueling conflicts that erupted with a ferocity unmatched by external battles. Villagers who encountered the women of the Cangaço often spoke with fascination, describing them as both fierce and fragile, both respected and feared. They were not passive companions. Many of them fought with determination, proving their loyalty through hardship. But the very intensity of their involvement meant that tensions surfaced quickly. Leaders enforced strict control to prevent jealousy, disputes, or perceived disrespect. Breaking this fragile emotional order could trigger punishments crafted to protect the band's stability rather than to correct wrongdoing. And because these situations touched the deepest insecurities of the men, the punishments sometimes reached levels of cruelty that outsiders struggled to understand. Women inside the band could be punished for actions that seemed minor to observers. A comment made in frustration, a disagreement during a march, even a glance interpreted as challenge could ignite anger. Some punishments were meant to isolate rather than injure. A woman might be forced to remain silent for an entire day, excluded from conversations and decisions, a subtle psychological tactic that created fear of abandonment. In other moments, the punishments became physical, shaped by the volatile emotions of the men who believed that maintaining control was essential for survival. Yet the women were not merely victims of these dynamics. Their presence also influenced how men were punished. A cangacero, humiliated in front of women, suffered a deeper blow to his pride, and leaders understood that this social wound could control behavior more effectively than physical pain. The emotional atmosphere of the camp became a battlefield of its own, where dignity and dominance shifted in ways that shaped decisions far beyond the internal conflicts. Even the harshest punishments delivered to men often carried the unspoken weight of the women's silent witness, their reactions fueling shame or reinforcing power. In some accounts, women themselves participated in punishments, especially when betrayal or disrespect targeted them directly. These stories reveal a complex portrait of survival, where women adopted the same hardened instincts as the men, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. The Caatinga did not allow softness, it demanded resilience. And the women who survived within the Cangaço learned to wield authority in ways that mirrored the harshness of the world around them. Their involvement blurred assumptions about gender roles and exposed how deeply violence had shaped every aspect of life in the Badlands. What makes these dynamics haunting is how they reveal the emotional fragility hidden beneath the band's violent exterior. The Cangaceros fought governments, volantes, rival outlaws, and the relentless environment. But some of their greatest struggles occurred inside their own circle. Relationships became pressure points, trust became a volatile currency, and every misstep threatened to tear the fragile structure apart. Punishment, for both men and women, became a tool to manage these storms, though it often deepened the wounds instead of healing them. And from these intimate conflicts grew another layer of the Cangaço mythos, ritualistic punishments shaped not only by discipline or revenge, but by superstition, belief, and the need to give meaning to a world defined by violence. As night fell over the Caatinga and fires burned low, whispered stories hinted that discipline sometimes took on a spiritual edge, blending fear with mystery in ways that would leave lasting marks on the outlaw legend. As the emotional tensions of camp life rose and fell like the harsh winds of the Caatinga, another force shaped the punishments of the Cangaço, the world of superstition and ritual that ran deeper than any written law. The sertão was a place where religion, folklore, and fear blended into one, and the outlaws carried these beliefs with them as naturally as they carried their rifles. Many punishments were not just acts of discipline or revenge, but performances imbued with meaning, gestures designed to invoke spiritual authority or to manipulate the unseen forces they believed to govern their fate. This spiritual dimension added an unsettling layer to their brutality because it turned punishment into something larger than the moment, something meant to echo across the land. Travelers who passed through regions touched by the Cangaço often spoke of strange symbols left carved into tree trunks or scratched onto stones near the aftermath of a raid. Some villagers interpreted these marks as warnings, others as curses, and when a punishment was carried out under these signs, the fear spread faster than any rumor. It was not only the violence that terrified people, but the suggestion that the bandits operated with the blessing or command of forces beyond human understanding. This belief gave the cangaceiros a psychological advantage. People feared not just their weapons, but their rituals. Some punishments took place at specific hours of the night, often during the silence between moonrise and dawn. Witnesses recounted moments where the band arranged themselves in a semicircle while the leader performed an action that seemed both practical and symbolic. A knife placed at the victim's feet. A rope coiled like a serpent. A handful of earth sprinkled onto the ground. None of these acts had an official explanation, but their consistency suggested an internal structure of meaning. Whether these gestures were inherited traditions or improvised symbols of control remains unclear, yet they created an ambiance that blurred reality with superstition. Fear in the sertão was amplified by isolation, and stories grew with each retelling. People believed the cangaceiros carried talismans, invoked saints with secret prayers, or performed rituals before dangerous raids. Some even claimed that certain punishments were designed to appease spiritual forces, offering the suffering of one man to protect the entire band. The truth likely varied from group to group, but the impact was undeniable. These beliefs transformed punishment into something that resonated long after the act itself, embedding terror into the cultural memory of the region. Inside the band, superstition shaped behavior as much as discipline. A cangaceiro who broke an unspoken spiritual rule might face consequences different from those imposed for disobedience. Men avoided certain trees, refused to step across particular animal tracks, or performed small rituals before sleeping. Leaders understood that these beliefs helped maintain order. When punishment was delivered with a ritualistic tone, it reinforced the idea that the outlaws were bound not only by loyalty but by forces. None of them wished to challenge. The culmination of violence and belief created a psychological landscape where every punishment carried dual weight. It corrected behavior, asserted power, and sent a message. But it also touched the realm of the sacred, turning suffering into a symbol whispered across the Badlands. Villagers avoided places where ritual punishments occurred, convinced that the land itself held memory of the screams. Such details may sound exaggerated, but in the sertão, fear was shaped as much by imagination as by reality. And as these ritualistic acts spread through oral tradition, they became part of the mythic identity of the Cangaço. Punishment was no longer just a human act. It became a sign, a story, a shadow that followed the outlaws through every village they touched. If any of these rituals or symbols stir your curiosity or remind you of how belief can shape power, share your thoughts in the comments so we can explore these deeper mysteries together. As these ritualistic layers deepened the aura of the Cangaço, another method of punishment emerged, one far more visible and far more terrifying: the transformation of the human body into a message. In the sertão, where communication traveled slowly and memory lingered for generations, the outlaws understood that a single mutilated body could shape the behavior of entire regions. They used this knowledge with precision. The corpses left behind after a raid or a betrayal were not simply evidence of violence. They were statements carefully positioned along dusty paths, crossroads, or the outskirts of villages to speak for the band long after the men had disappeared into the Villagers described the chilling sight of encountering these remains, often arranged with deliberate symbolism. A severed ear tied to a branch, a hand positioned on the chest, or a body laid out facing the rising sun. These details were not random. Each arrangement served a purpose, carrying layered meanings that varied depending on who discovered them. To some, it signified retribution for betrayal. To others, it warned against aiding the government or rival groups. And for many, it was simply a brutal reminder that the cangaceiros operated beyond any moral system they understood. One of the most disturbing practices was the marking of enemies through mutilation. Removing ears, fingers, or even facial features turned the dead into permanent records of their crimes, at least as interpreted by the band. The mutilation was not only physical, it attacked identity itself. A man with no face could no longer be recognized, stripping him of the last dignity that death usually preserves. Such acts created a psychological impact that no written decree could rival. Villagers would speak of these corpses for years, describing them in hushed tones around fires, amplifying the legend of the outlaws with each retelling. Even more unsettling were the cases where the body was not left intact but divided and scattered. Salmi leaders believed this prevented the spirit of the enemy from following the band. Others used the tactic to send messages to multiple villages at once. A hand might be found near a riverbed, while the rest of the body lay miles away along a cattle path. Each discovery sparked fear, confusion, and speculation, feeding the mythic power of the cangaceiros. The outlaws knew that fear multiplies when meaning becomes uncertain, and these fragmentary punishments created precisely that effect. The display of heads was perhaps the most infamous tactic. Placed on stakes near village entrances or crossroads, they forced travelers to confront the consequences before they even heard the stories. For people of the sertão, the human face carried symbolic weight. Seeing it separated from the body invoked deep spiritual unease. The outlaws relied on this reaction. A decapitated enemy became a silent spokesperson for the band, warning that loyalty mattered, betrayal would be punished, and resistance was useless. The message required no translation. It lingered in the mind long after the physical remains decayed. Not all of these displays resulted from cruelty alone. Some were strategic responses to the government's own violent practices. Volantes frequently displayed the heads of fallen cangaceiros in town squares, believing it would weaken their legend. The outlaws mirrored this tactic to reclaim psychological ground. Violence became a dialogue between two forces that used the human body as their language. Each display was a chapter in an ongoing conversation of dominance, fear, and retribution. What makes these stories especially haunting is how they reveal the landscape itself as part of the punishment. The Caatinga, with its thorny silence and endless emptiness, amplified the horror. A lone corpse on a white stretch of dust became a monument to terror, untouched for days, watched only by vultures and wind. And as people slowly uncovered these scenes, they stitched them into the collective memory of the region, shaping the legend of the Cangaço as a force that controlled not only people, but the very geography they lived in. The horror of bodies displayed across the sertão told only half the story. The other half came from what happened when the cangaceiros themselves fell into the hands of their enemies. For all the brutality the outlaws unleashed, they faced an equally merciless response from the authorities and the private armies of Corone, who saw them as a direct challenge to their power. In many ways, the punishments delivered against captured cangaceiros rivaled or even surpassed the cruelty of the bandits, exposing a violent symmetry between both sides of the conflict. The sertão became a theater where each faction tried to outdo the other in making an example of its prisoners. Government forces rarely treated captured outlaws as ordinary criminals. They treated them as symbols, threats that needed to be erased not only physically but psychologically. Reports described cangaceiros beaten long before interrogation began, their bodies dragged through camps to remind newcomers of the consequences awaiting anyone who dared align with bandits. These punishments were not about extracting information. They were about shattering pride. Many soldiers believed that humiliating a cangaceiro broke the invisible shield of legend that protected the band. And once that shield cracked, they hoped the fear surrounding the outlaws would weaken. Some of the most haunting accounts came from executions carried out in total darkness. Instead of shooting their captives quickly, soldiers sometimes forced them to wait through long hours of silence, unsure when the final moment would come. That psychological torture, stretching between fear and resignation, was meant to dismantle the legendary aura of courage the bandits cultivated. A man who trembled before death, the authorities believed, would undermine the myth that died proudly with rifles raised. But the truth was far more complex, as many outlaws faced death with the same fierce resolve they carried in life, creating stories that continued to fuel the movement rather than weaken it. The ultimate punishment imposed by the government mirrored what the cangaceiros themselves practiced. The public display of town squares became stages where the heads of notorious bandits were placed for residents to see. Newspapers published photographs, turning death into propaganda. Children were brought to witness the exhibits, encouraged to remember that order had triumphed. Yet these displays produced an effect opposite of what the authorities intended. Instead of erasing fear, they reinforced the mystique of the people whispered that men whose heads were shown in the plaza had lived boldly, defied the powerful, and died in battle. The punishment meant to intimidate often transformed the outlaws into martyrs in the eyes of the poor. Cangaceiros, the women of the band, suffered punishments that exposed brutal double standards. Soldiers frequently humiliated them publicly, mocking their roles as fighters. Some accounts describe forced hair-cutting, symbolic stripping of identity meant to punish not only the individual but the idea of women wielding power in the community. Others faced harsher fates, treated as trophies rather than prisoners. Yet, even in these circumstances, their stories often spread through the sertão with a mixture of horror and admiration, as villagers recounted how some resisted until the final moment or refused to reveal band secrets despite unbearable pain. These government responses fueled a cycle of escalating violence. Every mutilated body displayed by authorities provoked the Cangaço to respond with equal ferocity, and every brutal act by the outlaws pushed the state to intensify its reprisals. The sertão became trapped in a feedback loop where punishment no longer served justice but nurtured legend. Each side used suffering to carve meaning into the landscape, turning victims into symbols and violence into narrative. And through this grim exchange, the people caught in the middle learned that power in the Badlands did not belong solely to the gun, the badge, or the outlaw, but to the stories carried across the dust by those who survived long enough to speak. From this collision of authority and rebellion, one final layer emerges, revealing how these acts of punishment transcended the moment and became the myths whispered across generations, shaping the way the Cangaço is remembered even today. As stories of state retaliation spread, something remarkable happened across the sertão. The punishments, the mutilations, the public displays, and the whispered rituals began merging into a collective memory that no single faction controlled. Neither the cangaceiros nor the government owned the narrative anymore. It belonged instead to the people who lived between them, the farmers who hid in their homes when gunfire echoed through the brush, the travelers who crossed trails marked by vultures circling overhead, the women who tended to wounds without knowing whether the injured man was hero or criminal in the eyes of the next village. These ordinary witnesses shaped the legend more than any gun or decree. Fear became a form of inheritance. Children grew up hearing stories of bodies left at crossroads, of outlaws who punished betrayal with terrifying precision, of soldiers who displayed severed heads in plazas as warnings. Over time, these stories drifted away from strict fact and blended with imagination, taking on the tone of myth. Some embellished the brutality, others softened it, but all preserved the same underlying truth. Punishment in the Badlands was never just punishment. It was language, history, and identity intertwined. The sertão remembered through symbols carved in earth, scars on surviving bodies, and voices that refused to let silence erase the past. It was in this environment that the Cangaço transformed from a violent movement into a cultural scar. Each punishment, each act of retaliation, each ritualistic gesture became part of a folklore that stretched far beyond the men who lived it. Villagers repeated details with growing certainty: the glint of a knife under moonlight, the eerie silence before a raid, the marking of a traitor so that every settlement recognized his disgrace before he could speak. These recollections kept fear alive, but they also kept fascination alive. People began to see the outlaws not simply as criminals, but as embodiments of the chaotic justice of the sertão. And as decades passed, historians discovered that many of the most disturbing punishments were remembered not because they were the most violent, but because they carried meaning. A mutilated body laid at the edge of a village warned against betrayal. A head displayed on a wooden stake insisted that the struggle for power never ended. A captive forced to carry his own symbol of guilt reflected the constant tension between identity and survival. These elements became more than moments in time. They turned into metaphors for the harshness of life in the Badlands, a world defined by extremes of loyalty, fear, and vengeance. The myths that survived often blurred the lines between truth and exaggeration. Some punishments described in popular stories have no official record, yet they persist because they speak to something deeper than fact. They express the emotional truth of a land where justice rarely arrives through proper channels, where people created their own systems of accountability however brutal. It is this blend of reality and myth that keeps the legend of the Cangaço alive, whispered in conversations, painted in murals, staged in films, and retold in families whose ancestors lived through the turmoil. What remains certain is that punishment shaped the identity of the entire region. It dictated how people behaved, how they remembered, and how they taught the next generation to interpret danger. Even today, long after the last cangacero fell, stories of their punishments spark debate about morality, power, and the human capacity for cruelty when survival becomes the ultimate rule. And in that ongoing conversation, the sertão continues to speak. If you stayed with this story until now and felt the weight of these legends, leave a comment saying this story stayed with me too. Mark your place in this journey, and if the depth of these accounts resonates with you, consider subscribing so you can follow more explorations into the darker layers of history, and leave a like to support the work behind these narratives. There is another video waiting that expands on these themes, so take a moment and continue this path into the shadows where the past still breathes.